Okay, so in the last one, and like I said, I'm going to do it very, very informally, so you don't have to stress. We talked about scopophilia, which is the love of looking. Okay, so it's another word you can interchange with voyeurism. So, and we talked about cinema's reflexivity. So what that means is the ability to look back upon yourself. So as you can see, even though Rear Window is an act of cinema, it's actually talking about this experience of viewing and watching, and we become aware of ourselves as an audience. We become aware of ourselves as watchers. Jeffrey's Rear Window is like our cinema screen. We're breaking down the fourth wall, all that sort of stuff. And so most literary critics look at that, and of course there are a lot of visual metaphors and symbols in the film to support it. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at an interpretation that goes beyond looking at cinema and the cinema experience, okay, the experience of watching. So this paper is going to argue that given the intense culture of suspicion and nervousness out of which Rear Window emerges, so that Cold War culture, okay, the visual and narrative strategies of the movies, this is going to interpret it with regards to political terms. All right, so the following part is going to give you a much stronger understanding of the politics that filters through the film. So at school they would have talked about Mccarthyism, they would have talked about all of that, but maybe just touched on it. All right, so I want to go through that in this paper with enough detail so that you know exactly what that's about. Yeah? Okay, so it's a political lens now. Yeah? Okay, so the film is obviously really preoccupied with surveillance. And obviously this is because the period in which it was made was really concerned about foreign infiltration, and spying and things like that. So on a political level, Mccarthyism is a term that basically illustrates the nervousness that surrounded the rise of communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe in the 1950s and the repercussions that had at home. So McCarthy was obviously a really prominent senator, which we're about to go into, but that term itself, McCarthyism, basically encapsulates the fear and suspicion surrounding communism and the way that was affecting American politics and American citizens. So Senator Joseph R. McCarthy was a chairman of the House Un-American Activities Committee, which you'll often refer to as HUAC. And so he basically became the figurehead of the anti-communist movement. So he was like determined and confident that communism had infiltrated American soil. He was very confident and determined to prove that, Americans were acting in a treasonous way. Do you know what we mean by treasonous? So like betraying their own government and their own country. So because he was so determined that communism was already here in America, although here is Australia, he engaged in what can be basically called a witch hunt, where they made accusations against people who were alleged communists or were alleged to have some kind of involvement in communism, because he wanted to kind of, catch them, convict them, make examples out of them. So what happened though, and what we can see through Senator McCarthy, who they're referring here as this Wisconsin senator, is that it can be seen that when you have a conflict with an outward enemy, in this case the Soviet Union, it can have an impact on domestic affairs and stuff inside your country. So some texts that Year 12s are studying at the moment looks at other periods like World War II and how Japan was an enemy then. And so people in Australia, if you were Japanese, it was really difficult and really tense. So a similar effect here, because they were in the Cold War, there's a lot of fear about Russia. It started to cause a lot of just domestic suspicions. So they developed this committee, the House of Un-American Activities Committee, which if you think about it, it's basically monitoring people who are doing things that are un-American, namely engaging in anything that's to do with communism. So they basically, as a house, which is a government department, they were entitled to call any citizen up, anybody, to testify regarding matters concerning alleged un-American activities. So they could just pick you up and say, right, you have to come to court, you have to prove that you're not involved in these un-American activities. Because of this surveillance, observation and accusations, a climate of suspicion and betrayal was fostered. Now, this is particularly because if you got called up in front of, the committee, one way of you showing that you're loyal to Hitchcock, you're loyal to the American side, would be to point the finger and call out other communists. So because of that, this brings in the idea of betrayal, this idea that people, to get out of being imprisoned and things like that, would betray other people, accuse other people, and it really spread. The way that they conducted their surveillance and their interrogation during this time was also a pretty massive infringement on private rights. So HUAC was awarded a lot of political powers. They could pretty much do a lot of whatever they wanted. So we can see in Rear Window, there's quite a bit of discussion going on between Jeff and Doyle regarding how much they should be permitted to intrude into other people's private lives. So whenever Jeff and Doyle have a conversation, Doyle's normally the more conservative one, saying that, there are things called warrants, there are, all these stages, whereas Jeff's more like wanting to just go in there and get it done. So that debate, as it plays out in the film, can actually be somewhat of a debate regarding surveillance, spying, and that sort of thing going in society at the time. So ironically, the Cold War conflict produced a climate at home that actually seemed to be a threat to the nation itself. It tended to be making people feel very vulnerable from inside, from their own people, as opposed to people from the Soviet Union. Now, a lot of private individuals, everyday people, business people, were subject to attack by what they've described here as McCarthyite hysteria. So do you know what we mean by hysteria? Okay, so hysteria is kind of like group craziness, when everyone's kind of whipped up into a frenzy. So everyone gets, really emotional or excited about something, maybe a bit irrational. And so when people are obviously pointing fingers, when people are scared, that can really create a mood that catches on like a fever. So McCarthyite here, normally we see them say McCarthy or Mccarthyism. Mccarthyism is the noun, McCarthyite is the adjective. Okay, so yeah, of course, a lot of private individuals were subject to attack, but a lot of public figures in Hollywood were also accused of being communist. So did they talk about that in school? No? Okay. So in the late 40s and early 50s, the FBI and House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, invested a lot of resources to trace and unveil alleged communist infiltration in the motion pictures industry, so in Hollywood and in film. So they were wanting to weed out communists or anyone involved with communism in Hollywood. So director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, he testified before HUAC on March 26, 1947. And do you remember when this film was produced? 1954. So you can see that it's pretty much a product of that era. So the director of the FBI said, "The communists have developed one of the greatest propaganda machines the world has ever known." Are you familiar with propaganda? Yeah, so like spreading political messages through media. So they said the communists, they have one of the greatest propaganda machines. They have been able to penetrate and infiltrate many respectable and reputable public opinion mediums. Communist activity in Hollywood is effective and is furthered by communists and sympathizers using the prestige of prominent persons to serve, often unwittingly, the communist cause. What can we do? And what should be our course of action? The best antidote to communism is vigorous, intelligent, old-fashioned Americanism with eternal vigilance. So basically what he's saying there is the Soviet Union, which is now Russia, he's saying the Soviet Union is using our industry, the Hollywood industry, by getting prominent directors and writers and things like that on their side to spread communist messages through their writing and through their film. So as a result, the film industry was really strongly monitored, and there were a lot of restrictions as well, because next thing you know, you're being called up in front of the court and then being accused of being a communist. Do you remember recently where America was going on a lot about how Russia had used Facebook to rig elections? So but basically, and that's what Trump and Putin had a chat about in the last meeting that they had, but it was basically the idea that Russia had been making a lot of fake pages and also a lot of fake ads to polarize American opinion to vote a particular way. It's because they wanted to vote a particular way, because they felt that one president would be better to them than another. So those sorts of accusations are very similar to this one, yeah? Okay, when Hoover asserted the imminent threat of foreign infiltration, cinema was still at the peak of its drawing power in the United States, with over 80 million tickets sold per week. As a consequence, as Shaw notes, those working in the film industry in the United States in the late 1940s were put under unprecedented political pressure to act in the national interest. So basically to make sure that the messages that they're spreading are really pro-American and couldn't be supporting the communist agenda in any way. Before the invention of commercial television in the 50s, the number of moviegoers was exceptionally high. So the government bodies went to great lengths to ensure Hollywood's output was in line with official Washington policies. The role of the FBI was particularly extensive at the time. They had a broad surveillance network aimed at unveiling communist subversion in the industry. So do you know what subversion means? All right, so I'll go through that one as well. Okay, so subversion is undermining the power or the authority of an established system or institution. So basically undermining the authorities of the government in this case. Or subversion could happen in high school if people undermine the authorities of the principal and the principal team and things like that. But that was a real concern. And so they really wanted to weed out any movies that were subverting American ideals. Furthermore, together with Hitchock, the Bureau, the FBI, pressured the industry into establishing a blacklist. So the blacklist was basically a list of directors, Hollywood people that were considered to maybe be somewhat communist, and therefore they really wouldn't even be able to work in the industry anymore. So Rear Window as a film obviously doesn't discuss this issue by, putting FBI members in the film or, putting communism or communists in the film. Because if they did, what would happen, do you think?
They would get...
Yeah, exactly. Blacklisted, wouldn't be able to talk about it. So instead they've used the power of allegory. So what's allegory? Okay, so allegory is when you use one situation, you use characters, animals, whatever, a situation different from what you want to talk about that reveals another message. So, for example, George Orwell once wrote a book called Animal Farm. I don't know if you've ever done that one.
Yeah.
And it's about a farm, lots of pigs and all this kind of stuff, but it's actually meant to be about Soviet Russia. So again, because it's tricky to get a message out at that time, they change it. So instead of really having FBI members and communists and actual Hollywood people, it's all set in this apartment complex to send the message instead. Okay, so even though it doesn't directly talk about it, it does engage with the implications of these intelligence agencies interfering with the filmmaker's efforts to produce a movie. Because this would be something that bothers Hitchcock particularly, is the fact that you've got the government messing with his creativity and his ability to put certain themes and ideas in his movies. So let's talk about Detective Doyle. He's not a member of the CIA or FBI, but, of course, as a detective, he's connected to the activity of information gathering. So if we analyse him, we can draw some parallels with the CIA or the FBI. However, we can also interpret Jeff as being somewhat of a surveillance individual as well. Anyway, Doyle actively tries to dissuade, opposite from persuade, so convince against, Jeff from pursuing the alleged murder across the yard by presenting or citing evidence against Jeff's observations and conclusions. So I'm just going to scan through the next sentence because it's a rather hardcore one. Okay, all right, fair enough. So what they say in this next sentence is basically, you know how Jeff is sort of, and the previous presentation looks at how Jeff can represent the director. He can represent the camera. He can even represent the projector. Do you know what a projector is in the film cinema? You know how it sort of projects the image onto the big screen from that little room at the back? So in the previous presentation, we looked at how Jeff's room is really dark. And he's making this narrative from everything he watches outside, so not only is he just watching it, but he's actually producing a story. How's Jeff producing a story? Just by watching stuff outside. We do watch that, yeah, but he also puts his own assumptions on it, doesn't he? Yeah, so he's making up who everybody is and what's going on in their lives. So he's got a lot of creative control there. He also holds his camera, so there's a lot that can associate him with being some kind of a filmmaker or auteur. That was a word from the previous presentation. Do you want me to... I'll go through... You know how a director just tells people where to point the camera and what angles and stuff? An auteur is a film director who influences their films so much that you could pretty much say they're like an author. So it's almost like a combination, isn't it, between author and director, auteur. Yeah, I'll see how it sounds. I might be saying it wrong. Let's have a look.
Auteur.
Auteur. So there you go. An auteur is basically a director who's so heavily involved that they actually transform the narrative, and that's something that Jeff does. So therefore, if we look at this restrictions that Doyle is trying to place upon Jeff, it's almost like the FBI or the CIA trying to restrict a filmmaker or a director trying to develop their narrative, trying to make their show. Do you know what I mean? So that can be part of the allegory there. Okay. However, using Doyle as a detective fulfilling this position is a little bit ambivalent. So what do we mean by ambivalent? Maybe far-fetched. Let's have a look here. So it could, yeah. So we don't. It's uncertain. There could be multiple different interpretations that you could use. For example, like I was saying before, Jeff could be the surveillance dude. He could be representing the CIA or the FBI spying on everybody. And Doyle could be the voice of reason saying, hey, don't do that, that's private. But anyway, so on the one hand, Doyle is one of these voices of reason. He doesn't want to jump to conclusions just because his friend has this fragmented and these subjective observations, yeah? So what do we mean by fragmented? Yeah, like broken up into pieces, not a complete picture. Subjective?
Arguably.
Yeah, it's like it's so personal from his perspective. He's not looking at it from an outsider, but an insider. So when Jeff demands that he uses his authority to search Thorwald's apartment, Doyle reminds him that it's forbidden to walk into an apartment and simply search it. Jeff, however, retorts that the end in this case may justify the means, so it might be worth it in the end, you know what I mean? But at the risk of sounding stuffy, Doyle responds, I'd like to remind you of the Constitution and the phrase, a search warrant issued by a judge who knows his Bill of Rights verbatim. He must ask for evidence. So here, Doyle is actually functioning as a defender of civil rights. So not like a member of the Hitchock who's prying into everybody's business and invading upon their civil rights, but actually a defender of civil rights. He's dismissing calls for private infringement on the basis of speculation. So he's saying, I'm not going to go into that person's private life based on your speculations, what you think is going on. We need actual evidence. We need a warrant. You know, there are legalities that surround this. So that can be a very anti-Hitchock message. On the other hand, though, anti against Hitchock. So, because Hitchock, the way they investigated things, they often didn't give a damn about civil rights. You know, they could pretty much call anybody up, interrupt their lives, blacklist anybody, and they didn't use a lot of evidence either in their investigation. So Doyle seems to be speaking out against that. On the other hand, his reluctance to investigate in the alleged case raises some suspicion. So the fact that he doesn't want to investigate seems a bit odd sometimes. When Jeff insists that Thorwald left his apartment in the middle of the night with a woman other than his wife, Doyle counters with 2 witnesses' accounts. When the former insists that the couple's appearance at a railway station was a mere deception manoeuvre, the detective is quick to cite a wire. And what's a wire in this context? It's a telegram. Do you know what a telegram is? Okay, so a telegram is kind of like, I don't know, the old school text messages. But what would happen is you'd basically call up and you'd say what you wanted to say, and then the person on the other end would sort of type it out and send it and that sort of thing. It's funny, I can't... There's obviously an app called Telegram now. That's why it's so hard to find pictures of old telegrams. But yeah, when they reference a wire, it's normally to do with having received a telegram or a message. Anyway, so he mentions this wire that Mrs. Thorwald apparently sent saying that she had arrived at a resort. Doyle seems to have a rebutting counter-argument for every observation of Jeff's fairly quickly. However, within the diegesis, now as we talked about in the previous presentation, the diegesis is inside the film world, inside the narrative world. Okay, so intradiegesis is sort of inside the film, extradiegesis is outside. But don't worry too much, if you go through that first presentation, it'll explain all what diegesis is and everything else like that. But he never tells us how he gets his evidence. So the thing is, the camera never follows the detective into the outside world. What is it? Doyle's appearance not beyond doubt. Okay, and they're going to lead to something else. But that's important to note, is we never see where Doyle gets his information from. In that way, he's very mysterious. He also tends to hold back his information until it's needed as well. So he's not very transparent. What do I mean by transparent? Yeah, that's it. And that could be a criticism of the way the government's conducting their affairs as well. In the era, they might not be very transparent. Doyle arrives at the apartment and receives a phone call on Jeff's phone. An anonymous man asks for him. And when Doyle picks up the receiver, he hears a voice ask, "Lieutenant Doyle, sir?" and answers, "Yeah, speaking." The conversation continues. However, on the soundtrack, the caller's voice is muted, while we hear Doyle giving short answers and comments. This peculiar incident renders his position even more ambivalent than before. Indeed, it seems as if a member of the intelligence agency is entitled to secrecy, while everyone else is not. So Doyle can decide what information he wants to give, what information he wants to keep, whereas the general public can't. So this sort of looks at some unfair entitlements of those in, say, the FBI, the CIA, with how they actually conduct their investigations. They're not very open. So the contents of the conversation are actually never revealed. It also becomes apparent that the intelligence body operates on levels that no one else can access. So the short scene reminds the extra-diegetic audience. Who's the extra-diegetic audience?
Us.
Outside the film, so us.
Yeah.
That Doyle is moving in a sphere where the private is subjected to heavy surveillance, but the citizens never get insight into what's going on. It's all very much kept from them. Okay, so what is most interesting about Hitchcock's movie is that it presents a suggestive combination of the extra-diegetic politics and intra-diegetic aesthetics. So what we see in the film and how that relates to the politics outside of the film. So therefore it's necessary to discuss the spatial givens of the movie, so how the space in the film is utilised and how they implicate the narrative construction of both the film's protagonists as well as the audience. So the implications that this storyline has for the film and their characters as well as the audience outside. In the credit scene, vivid jazz music sets in while the Paramount Studio logo fades away. The credits start to fade in and out. A tripartite open window fills the screen. So I'm pretty sure tripartite just means that the window's in 3 parts. Okay, yeah. So just a fancy word there, but wouldn't it sound cool if you said tripartite window in your essay?
What window is
just
tripartite?
window.
Is it?
Yeah, it's got 3 sections to it.
Okay.
Yeah, we can have a look at and double check that in a second, but yeah, it has 3 sections. So we've got this vivid jazz music, the Paramount Studio logo's fading away, credits are coming in and out, this tripartite open window fills the screen. All right, so we'll have a little look. One of the significances actually of that tripartite window, and something that reveals to us that this is making an explicit commentary about filmmaking, is the fact that when people film, they're expected to film using the rule of thirds. Do you know what the rule of thirds is? Okay, different types of shots. So I'll bring it up for you. So I'll just bring it down here. Okay, so basic rules of composition. The rule of thirds is a technique of dividing the frame up into it's a little bit different from what we see in the window because they actually divide the frame up into a 3x3 grid. So it's 9 boxes. What you generally do is put the subject in the center, but you can move them in other areas for different effects and meaning. What they do try to do in the rule of thirds is to balance the composition as well. So say, for example, you wanted to film the horizon. What you might do is make up the thirds so that perhaps the landscape goes up to the second third, heading upwards and vertically, and you might have a third of skyline there. If you don't obey the rule of thirds, apparently things look imbalanced and unnatural. But anyway, having that tripartite window could be an allusion to the filmmaking rule of thirds itself.
Yeah.
Anyway, so vivid jazz music, credits in and out. While the first 2 names appear and disappear on the screen, one of the 3 blinds starts to roll upward and without a visible operator, thereby revealing a backyard between 4 brick houses. The camera remains immobile, not moving, while the rest of the credits appear on the screen and the remaining blinds reveal more of the aforementioned yard. A few select movements can be discerned in the background: a car, a pedestrian on the street, and one of the neighbours in an open window. With the final credits fading out of the screen, the camera immediately starts to track, which is a movement, towards the window. It halts for a brief moment when it reaches the sill. So we'll have a look at that again in a moment. Then the first cut. So what's a cut in this context?
Just camera cutting to another
spot, yeah. So it's basically, it's where, because normally you have continuity editing, so it's filming. So the camera or the footage has been stopped there and it starts again at another point. You can have jump cuts, which are, might have the same setting, but there could be a little bit of a gap in time between. So you don't actually have to change to another location when you cut. You might just change to another angle or another view or another point in time as well. It's just literally where they've sliced the footage. Okay. So this one does happen to move. It creates a high angle shot and a slight tilt. So the pan is left to right, the tilt is up and down. The camera pursues a cat in a counter-clockwise order and subsequently pans through the yard, exhibiting various neighbours on their balcony and opposite windows. As the camera returns to the sill of the open window, it shows the forehead of our protagonist, bathed in perspiration as he sleeps in a wheelchair. So as you can see here, the language used shows real understanding of camels. The camera cuts again and shows a thermometer at 95 degrees Fahrenheit, only to start a second tour through the yard back to Jeff's leg. Subsequently, the camera roams around again, this time through his apartment. The two cyclical movements of the camera raise two important issues. Firstly, the camera is outstandingly mobile. It's capable of moving through space without any kind of narrative motivation. So what that's saying there is that the camera, the way it moves around, is not being directed by what the protagonist is looking at or to show us, well, like we don't think it's a particular scene of importance, but the way that your school's been talking about the cat, it's a huge scene of importance, But what they're saying here is it's like the camera has a mind of its own. It can just kind of roam about and look at everything. As it starts its tours after the credits, it's not attributed to a character's gaze. So normally we follow what characters are looking at. And as the quick framing of the protagonist reiterates, it is also not done so retrospectively. What they mean there is the camera gives us a sense a little bit of real time of the present. Do you know what I mean? Like we're watching something live.
Okay.
Yeah, so retrospectively means looking back on something that has happened. But we honestly feel like we're in this narrative as it unfolds, bit by bit. Like that moment when Thorwald stares at us. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So the very first scene puts emphasis on the importance of the spatial arrangement of this fictional world. So the way that in this first scene the camera's looking about everywhere on its own accord shows us that the spatiality, the way everything is laid out, is important. Though limited in terms of spatial complexity, which means that obviously we're just in the backyard of some apartments, it's not too, we don't go anywhere else. The narrative space stands in opposition and thus contrasts Jeff's immobility. So what that means is the narrative space where everything's occurring is in contrast to him, because while they can all move, scenes can change, even the camera can move, he's stuck. Yeah? The tour through the living room hints at the temporal dimension of the narrative. So do you know what I mean by temporal?
No.
All right. So if we look at temporal, it means relating to time and space, basically. So here they said relating to worldly as opposed to spiritual affairs. That's a different definition, but here they put time, So normally when we talk about something being spatial, we're interested in how the space is set out. When we're talking temporal, we're talking about the way that time is used. And like I was saying before, the temporal dimension of this particular film seems very much set in the present, doesn't it?
Yes.
We get a strong sense of real time. We get scenes that just play out in front of us without huge cuts, really long scenes. So that's more like real life than it is of a movie where you'd be jumping to different places and different times. So what is foregrounded on the one hand is Jeff's profession and his equipment. We see metonymic references of its function within the diegesis. Do you know the word metonymic?
No.
Okay, metonymic it's like a metaphor, but it's when you use part of something to represent the whole. So for example, if I said to you, give me a hand, do I just want your hand?
Yes.
No, I want all of you, yeah? So I said, give me a hand taking this rubbish bin out, and you get a saw and you just like cut off your hand and then you give it to me, yeah? If I said, well, that's really going to offend the crown, am I talking about a gold object that's really upset? What am I talking about?
The Queen?
Yeah, and the royal family and stuff like that. So what they're saying is metonymy is in place here, visual metonymy, because we see lots of hints of Jeff's profession, don't we?
Yeah.
A camera, some photographs, things like that. That's metonymy representing his profession as a whole.
Yeah.
Small objects that represent his profession as a whole. And his military past is also stressed through the images on the walls that bear military affiliation. So, okey-dokes. So there are 3 photographs on the wall showing firemen fleeing from a fire, a man with a rifle, presumably in a war zone, and 3 soldiers in front of a large smoke column that is reminiscent of a mushroom cloud, respectively. The images make it clear that he is not only willing to remember this time, because he's got the photos there, he actually wants it to linger on in his memories. He wants to remember those moments. Jeff's service in the army is never explicitly addressed except for a brief comment of his to Doyle and the fact that the Doyle talks about reconnaissance and whatever else. The images constitute the visual preface to the main narrative and thus provide a significant backdrop for the story that also bears extra diegetic connotation. I'll break this part down. So what do we mean by preface?
Not sure.
Which I often used to say preface. I guess some people say preface.
I do.
Preface.
Preface. But that's the introduction of the book normally. So what we see around his apartment, they not only preface the intradiegetic narrative that's going to occur regarding Jeff, but they also preface extra-diegetic connotations. So they all have connections with things that are going on in society at the time or recently. The military frame is also reinforced by the other 2 items that are of particular importance. There's a shattered camera that comes before, the images on the wall, which the obvious conclusion being that it's been damaged during the race that Jeff photographed and that caused his injury, because we see that tire bouncing towards the camera. Together with the war images, the broken camera and the image of the race imply that Jeff has chosen a hazardous profession in order to perhaps retain his military way of life. So this new profession has continuous reassignment, danger, and self-reliance. So the earlier parts of these tutorials, we actually talked about how there's a message in this film to do with returned soldiers from World War II and how they're dealing with their adjustments. And that actually relates a lot to Jeffries as well. Particularly people who came back and they were injured during the war. So these tokens function as a reminder that the early 50s, do you remember the year this was made?
1950?
1954. And many of the prevalent discourses were heavily influenced by the domestic aftermath of World War II. What do you think they mean by domestic aftermath?
Is it like after the World War II, the woman didn't want to go? There was a lot of conflict between the women and the men.
There certainly was, but domestic just generally means at home.
Okay.
So it means the effects of the war back on home soil. Yeah. So the visual reminders of the war also immediately indicate that Jeff functions as a latent memento of a wounded veteran. So do we know what latent means?
Nope.
Okay. So latent being sort of existing, but not obviously. So they've said here dormant, underlying, but not obvious on the surface. Do you know what I mean? So he's not explicit. Obviously we don't see this, but it is there underlying what we see.
Yeah.
Memento is so a reminder. So even though it's not really explicitly discussed, he is a reminder of the war that occurred or of a wounded veteran. Yeah. As Colleen Glenn notes, the connection between Jimmy Stewart's post-war roles and the heightened anxieties... do you know who Jimmy Stewart is?
No.
The fellow that plays Jeffries.
Jimmy, okay.
Yeah, and Hitchcock actually liked to use him in a lot of movies. He's like one of his favourites. But anyway, so he played a lot of roles after the war, and there were heightened anxieties regarding the soldiers' homecoming as well. And not a lot of people have discussed that, though. With regards to this analysis to Colleen Glenn, she was interested in the considerable number of roles after World War II in which Stewart portrayed men who were increasingly disturbed or neurotic. Why would Colleen Glenn find it interesting that Jimmy Stewart kept playing these roles after the war of men who had some kind of neurosis or they were disturbed. Do you know what neurotic means?
No.
Okay, so neurosis is you got a bit of mental illness, you're not really in touch with reality.
Mhm.
Do you know what I mean? So Jimmy Stewart would play roles after World War II where his character had a bit of mental instability. So why do you think that's interesting?
Is it to show something's wrong with him?
As an actor or as a character?
Reminder of the effects of war.
Exactly, because a lot of the men coming back from war would have had some mental issues, wouldn't they? From the trauma and everything like that. Hitchcock did this film Vertigo. Did you watch that YouTube video I sent you about blocking in Vertigo? If you go back through all my emails, you'll find one where where it demonstrates how Hitchcock uses blocking, which is active positioning, in this film called Vertigo.
Is it the one with the bathroom deaths and all that?
No, that's Psycho.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's all right. I'll send you that link as well, though. So, again, it's really reminiscent of this disturbed mental illness. Yeah. But anyway, Stewart himself, Jimmy Stewart, actually served in the Army Air Corps as a pilot. And so therefore he actually, as an actor, has some real understanding of how he should manifest in these roles. What have we got here? In light of the prominence of military material in the movie, I would argue that the figure of Jeff stands in for a broader phenomenon of the post-war era, namely this reintegration of the millions of war veterans in society. Okie dokes. Cool. Although Jeff perceives his forced absence from his profession as a break from his ordinary daily routine, it is justified with the focus on his status as a veteran in mind, to argue that the injury constitutes the opposite. His photojournalism, with its adrenaline-oriented tasks and the obvious threat for life and limb, bears resemblance to Jeff's position taking aerial reconnaissance photos during the war, which is what he did with Doyle. The 6 weeks rehabilitation phase, therefore, is the beginning of his reintegration into society. Despite the tranquil urban setting he finds himself in now, the beginning of the movie still recalls his former occupation. There's hints towards war and conflict everywhere. As the camera pans through the courtyard for the first time, it captures a hovering helicopter over the yard, dangerously close to 2 young women. Other critics have described it as a perfect vehicle for the spectatorial desire to enjoy a fantasy omniscience, all-seeing, all-knowing, to go everywhere and see everything. The helicopter evokes the technological resources available to the cinema and enlistable in the service of the scopic drive, scopic to do with seeing. The aspect of visual pleasure is valid in this episode, but it ignores the decidedly military slant. In fact, as Michael Chion, shrewdly points out, when the camera returns from its first pan, Jeff's back is turned to the courtyard while he's asleep. Therefore, it seems as if the yard were a sort of extension of his dream-filled cranium. So it's almost like what's happening in the yard is almost like part of his dream. The image of the helicopter floating above the yard can thus be read as a spatial and contextual conflation of his military past with his civilian presence. So I'm just going to break that down just a little bit. But, I mean, you've got to agree that helicopter's out of place. In fact, the special effects are so bad it makes it even look even more out of place. And so what they're saying here in this particular interpretation, I don't know if you'd want to go there in an essay because it would get quite complicated, but the fact that he's turned away from the window, it's like everything out there is somewhat imagined or a dream-like or things like that. And this person's saying, isn't it interesting that there's a helicopter there and he's somewhat... that might be something that he would dream about because of all his war flashbacks and things like that. But certainly the presence of the helicopter does seem to be incongruous with what's going on out there. But as we talked about before, that helicopter is a vehicle for spectatorial desire, this idea of fantasy omniscience, the idea of being able to see everyone even in their private moments. Yeah. So the helicopter has both military connotations as well as connotations of scopophilia, which is mentioned in the previous presentations, the love of looking. So it's another word you can swap out voyeurism with, scopophilia.
Okay.
So the diegetic world, the world, inside the film, is thus marked as a heterogeneous site, I probably pronounced that wrong, where different levels of signification coincide, come together. So let's have a look at the actual pronunciation of that word.
Heterogeneous.
Actually, I think that's what I said, wasn't it? Heterogeneous. Heterogeneous means really diverse with regards of character and content. So all they're saying here is the diegetic world of the film, the inside of the film is very diverse with the cross-section of references and characters and going-ons that it brings all together in the one space. So we could therefore describe it as being heterogeneous. The notion of multiple meanings of the surface images also holds for what various critics describe as the reciprocal relationship between the primary narrative that Jeff belongs to and the sub-narratives played out in the windows. So what they're saying here is that we've got this relationship occurring, reciprocal, going both ways, between the primary narrative of Jeff and then there's the sub-narratives of all what's going on in the windows. But you can use that in your essay as well, primary narrative and sub-narratives relating to the lives that are occurring across the yard and what's occurring inside Jeff's apartment. At the same way, think of ways that you can bring in intradiegetic and extradiegetic. So extradiegetic being any relationships to post-World War II, to HUAC, to Cold War era. Intradiegetic meaning going on inside the film. Extradiegetic relating to the audience as well. All right, so, okay. So as Glenn correctly points out, one of the traits of trauma, a condition that Jeff might well suffer from, is its displacement from the original event. I'll talk about that in a second. Displacement, well, actually I'll define it now. Basically means the action of moving one thing from its original place to another. So obviously when you've got returned soldiers, veterans, especially those suffering from trauma, it's basically taking something that was from the war zone and bringing it back into the domestic realm. Similarly to how that helicopter is there out of nowhere, you know what I mean? Jeff's troubled memory of the war and his remaining aggressive potential is actually displaced, this person's feeling, into the other windows. John Fowell, another critic, wrote, "Perhaps no Hitchcock film is so packed with doubles as Rear Window, with its dozen or so miniature reflections of Jeff and Lisa. Hitchcock was at his cleverest in the games he played in these apartments, which represent a colourful play filled of hidden parallels and symbols." So what they're talking about with this paralleling is kind of a mirror effect. So isn't it so coincidental that everything that's going on between Jeff and Lisa and also Doyle has connections to everything that's going across the way. And we also see that Jeff is so cynical, as you've written about in your essay, with how he interprets what's going on across the way. It's almost like he's really frustrated, So it's almost like what he's doing is he's projecting his own frustration and discontent with the domestic sphere he's found himself in, with what he's observing across the way. You know, if he's troubled, if he's not liking where he's at, nobody else in his eyes is liking where they're at as well. So that's all about projection and displacement, okay, moving his feelings to another place with other people. So a lot of these sub-narratives contribute meaning and insight into the primary narrative. In this case, in a very explicit way, because often Jeff and Lisa actually talk about what's going on across the way. Anyway, so John Fowell, devotes 2 chapters of his book to deciphering the significance of every window in relation to the main narrative. Sounds like a good book to read. For him, and a majority of critics alike, the most significant connections are to be drawn between the love plot of Jeff and Lisa and the murder plot of the Thorwalds. So this piece is now actually going to go in and draw out some of Farwell's stuff with regards to how what's going on between Jeff and Lisa is actually reflected in the Thorwalds relationship.
Yeah.
And we will cover that in part 3.